want you to get us into this now, this sort of second phase of this conversation, and the what should be done part of it. Briefly as you can, because you've had the floor for a while, but just give us in a sort of crystallized form what you think now, given everything you've just said, should be the course of action. Then I want to hear Rana, and then
sure. I mean, look, I am pro-intervention with respect to Syria, but pro-intervention with the following caveat: I think intervention at this point is inevitable. I don't see how this regime, although its fall might be construed as inevitable, that's certainly what the White House has been saying, it could still very well carry on for at least a year, if not more.
Can you define for us what you mean by intervention?
I believe in the sort of safe zone scenario for Syria, one that is being now mooted by the Turkish government, which has been threatened to be imposed by the Turkish government since last June. And I also would agree that there needs to be some kind of aerial component. I mean, the rebels cannot face tanks and helicopter gunships, which are now firing on them, alone. There needs to be some kind of full-scale military intervention. By that, I don't mean an occupation a la Iraq. I'm talking about things that are already being put into motion or already being considered by the United States and by Turkey.
So an enforced no-fly zone.
An enforced no-fly zone.
Could that be, I'm sorry to just hurry you through this, but could that be like on the sort of Libya model, where that means not just enforcing it, but actually taking out Syrian air defense capability?
Yes, and also, I mean, keep in mind, a no-fly zone doesn't just necessarily bomb barracks. In fact, I don't think that in this case that's called for it. It would also target the placement of heavy artillery, tanks. It would also control the M1 highway, which is the main ground transport throughout all of Syria. You can't really conduct this kind of ground campaign against the rebels if you can't operate on the main thoroughfares of the country. So yes, it would be similar to a Libya-style intervention, but not exact, of course. The two countries are vastly different in many ways.
Nadim, you're shaking your head.
This is disastrous option. If this option goes, you don't know what the capabilities of the Syrian army. We're talking about one of the mightiest armies in the Middle East. With tanks and heavy artillery and warships and jet fighters and what are you going to destroy, and how much are you going to destroy without going into a full war with the country? I mean, this is absolute disastrous option. And another thing I want to correct, just one little thing. First of all, Christians are not 5%. This is absolute nonsense. We are about 12 to 14%, and we were 18 to 25% before the emigration in the last 20-25 years. And another thing is the intervention will open the country into an abyss of violence. Only God knows what will happen. I think this option is brutal, bitter, and it has no sense of what the country is about and what is the movement is about. And the last thing I want to say before I say what I think the solution
we'll come back to that in a minute. I want to get Michael to respond. This is not
a Sunni revolution. This I've never ever heard in 1 year since the trouble started in Syria anybody describing this as a Sunni revolution. And Malik, you have to decide, either it is a revolution or a civil war. And I do not accept that a civil war is a revolution in the same thing. Okay. And the Sunni are not only those who are involved in what is happening in Syria.
We may get back into that later about the nature of it, and Malik will have a chance. Let's just stay on this intervention point for a moment. Rana, am I right that you would agree broadly with Michael on intervention? And if you do, if I'm right on that assumption, what do you say to Nadim, who says this would open the country into the abyss, it would be bitter and brutal?
I find myself in a very bizarre position simply because I was one of the most ferocious critics of any attempt to intervene in Iraq, although knew full well the utter brutality of Saddam Hussein, very similar to the brutality of the Assads, I may say. But in the year that we've witnessed innocent people being slaughtered on an industrial scale in Syria, my feeling is now one that you cannot allow an armed mafia to take revenge on an entire country without allowing some protection for civilians. Now, what that kind of protection might take is something that we have all as Syrians debated very painfully. It's not an easy thing to say with the example of Iraq fresh in our mind, that yes, we do want military intervention, but I think what we do absolutely need are safe corridors that would enable families of displaced persons to reach safety without being killed. We would need safe corridors for defectors. The reason we don't have the kind of defection on a large scale from the army is because the price of defection is intolerably high. And it's not just the people who defect who are shot, but their entire families.
But when people hear a phrase like safe corridors, they think, who could be against safe corridors? That sounds wonderful. But to do that, to enforce it, will mean heavy-duty
You would need air cover
force.
for that.
And that, what Nadim, Nasser and others are not in the room now warn, is that that will mean a huge unleashing of a kind of bloodbath.
Well, we already have a bloodbath of stupendous nature.
I want to get Paul Conroy in on this because I want to know just almost how it felt when you were there, that moment when you were under attack, but even before then, when you saw people being killed, did you yourself think the only way to solve this is the outside world has to act?
Absolutely. It's one thing, I guess, seeing it from a distance, to be involved in it, to watch people dying for a piece of bread, the risks people were taking just to feed themselves. There is no option. You know, they are a well-trained army, but it was actually pointed out to me by many military defectors, high-level military defectors, that the Syrian army is a big, powerful army. It's also not an army that is actually trained to fight wars with other armies. It's an army based around civil suppression of civilians. So when it comes to taking out, as would be the case if we're to create safe corridors and safe havens, they're not such big guys when it comes to that. They're very good at surrounding civilians and killing them.
In other words, what the kind of remedies that Michael Weiss is advocating, you're saying the price wouldn't be so unbearably high?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, we overestimate the scale and the size of the Syrian capability to fight back when it is an army and not a civilian population.
Because Michael put all this on the table, so I'm going to come back to him, but before we do, I want to get the sense of the other panelists. You've heard now 3 voices, 2, I would say, Rana and Paul Conroy, actually broadly, perhaps with some hesitation, but saying yes to military intervention, and Nadim very powerfully saying no. Where are you on it, Roger Cohn?
Well, I think we've got to bring, for a moment anyway, Kofi Annan, if you don't mind, into this debate, because that's kind of where the international community is right now. And the arrival of Annan has involved a subtle, or maybe not so subtle, shift. I mean, earlier this year, we had President Obama calling for the ouster of Assad, saying he has to go. And joined pretty much by Europe, with the Russians and the Chinese obviously dissenting. And now we have the Annan Plan, which does not actually call for him to go, but calls for basically arms to be set aside, withdrawals from city centers by both sides, and a conversation that may or may not lead to his going. Now, I don't think this is going to work in the current circumstances. I think the situation's gone too far. It will not be possible, I think, to get the opposition to sit down with Assad. So where does that leave us? In my view, you have to try to level the playing field and do so as quickly as possible. Now, we've seen the decisions in Istanbul. I can assure you there's a lot more going on, I'm convinced, beneath the radar. I mean, paying salaries to the FSA, and what exactly, they're going to be put on some payroll or something? No, I mean, we need to get cash and a lot of it to the opposition. There are ways to encourage the process of defections that's already going on. I think this has to be pursued as energetically as possible in order to hurt the Assad regime and begin to get the kind of balance where some kind of negotiated outcome might be possible. I don't think...
Sorry, Roger, just before you go on there, when you say giving cash, do you go further and say arms? It's arms that...
Yes, arms, cash, logistics, wherewithal.
I mentioned
I'm not in... I mean, in an election year, with Iran hovering in the background, with Israel where it is on Syria, I don't see NATO planes in the skies over Syria. I'm trying to deal here with realistic options. I don't regard that as a realistic option. Ain't going to happen, at least not in my view. So that leaves me, given that I don't think the Annan plan can work, that leaves me with arm, support, bolster the FSA, the rebels, and try and get them to be as coherent and effective as possible.
You'll remember that when, because you mentioned the Balkan Wars, which you covered, that the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Douglas Herder, he was under pressure to give arms to the Bosnians, and he said, it's not levelling the playing field, it's levelling the killing field. All you do is you ensure more people die.
No, it was prolonging the killing fields, and when was Bosnia halted? It was when NATO did actually
but in the end, it was playing. Yeah, so would it be enough?
It may. I don't know where we're going to be. I think. Look, one thing is certain in Syria, in my view at least, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
Malik, we haven't heard from you on this.
Yeah, just to get back very quickly. I never said that it was a Sunni revolution. It's a revolution by Sunnis, and there's a big difference for democracy that everyone's going to enjoy, whether they're Muslim or Christian. Whether 5% or, as you say, 12%. So I just wanted to make that very clear.
Okay.
Regarding intervention or what the West should do, I think, yes, in an ideal situation, I would agree that humanitarian corridors, safe zones, you name it, no-fly zones, brilliant, but it's never going to happen. And it's never going to happen because I think the United States has reached the conclusion that a choice to topple Bashar al-Assad, and let's be quite clear, if the United States, NATO gets involved, I think the regime will crumble very quickly. But a quick crumbling of the regime, or a quick collapse of the regime, will inevitably lead to a prolonged Lebanon-style civil war and potentially the partition of Syria. And this is a very real prospect, by the way. So,
should we interpret you saying that as meaning that you're urging us to be careful what we wish for, in a way? Are you saying that if the regime collapses, it's not wholly a good thing?
Well, to be realistic, even if the regime collapse, look, the regime probably has about 2 million hardcore supporters. And again, I'm being very realistic and very honest with you. The regime does have those people. And Gaddafi didn't have 2 million people, hardcore supporters, nor did Mubarak, but Bashar al-Assad does, and that's the primary reason why he's still in power. And those 2 million people aren't simply going to go away. They're going to stay in Syria. They're probably going to fight. They're going to reinforce their own areas, and they're probably going to, fight against the central government, whoever takes control in Damascus. So, we have to be realistic about this. What can be done immediately? I think the West can, perhaps through the Qataris and the Saudis, for instance, they can support local military councils, and they are being set up to organize the Free Syrian Army on a local level. They can support those people. Problem is, the Jordanians and the Turks won't allow arms in. They won't even allow humanitarian aid through their border. So this is a big logistical problem. You can pay FSA fighters salaries, but I don't see how that's going to help. You need weapons.
So,
particular type of weapons.
Okay, so we're coming to the chase here. The proposal you would support is the same as Roger Cohen's, arming the opposition.
Yeah, look, as long as Bashar al-Assad believes that he can win militarily, and at the moment he does believe he can win militarily, then there will be no political solution. And ultimately, there has to be a political solution. There can be no other solution. So it's about forcing Bashar al-Assad to sit on the negotiating table.
And he'll only do that if he faces an armed opposition that could seriously fight him at least to a stalemate.
Absolutely.
How much are you going to arm the opposition? How much are you going to give those people, the few hundreds or thousands of soldiers? How many tanks are you going to give them? How many jet fighters? How many fighting ships? And how much can you give that? You need a whole army to fight the Syrian army. So let me state what I think the solution is. If we look at history, and you, Malik, said we can't understand the area without going back to history, and this is exactly what I'm going to do. If you go not only the history of the area, the history of the world, we see that no violence stopped, no war finished, no hostile disagreement came to an end without dialogue. We have tried everything. We see that the country is open for really unlimited options of hostile and violent options. Why don't we try something we have not tried yet, which is the dialogue? If we look at the Israeli-Arab conflict, when did the Israeli-Arab conflict come to the closest of being solved? 1990 in Madrid, when all came and sat around the table and talked with each other. Then, 1990 Madrid conference led to the Arab League initiative in Beirut after that, and the Arab League initiative was a fantastic opportunity which was missed to bring peace. Now what I propose is an international conference outside Syria, choosing a country which is a neutral country, bringing all the political spectrum of Syria, including the regime, and I say outside Syria because we don't want anybody to manipulate.
But what the point Malik put to the room before was that Assad himself won't go or be serious about any such meeting unless he feels there's a real threat to his power.
I'm saying this option has not been tried, and I am appalled and I am very disappointed that in all the agendas I've seen and I've read and I've talked to people in the West about, the option of dialogue, the option of people sitting together, putting all the cards on the table is not there. Neither Hague, nor Juppé, nor Mr. Obama, nobody is talking about bringing the people together.
Three people at least want to get back to you on exactly this point. Michael, we haven't heard from a while. As quick as you can on this, then Roger and Rana.
The notion that dialogue hasn't been tried is a myth. In a few weeks, Barack Obama called for the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime. It took him, I think, until September or October to make the U.S. policy explicitly one of regime change in Syria. In all that time, we're talking from the beginning of the uprising in April to September, October, Bashar al-Assad had innumerable opportunities to institute the reforms that he claimed he was willing to make. The dialogue doesn't work. The man is motivated by one thing, which is his own survival. The perpetuation of a regime that has been in place for 40 years, that has greatly enriched him and his clan and his inner circle. He doesn't see this as a sort of, either we get a political solution or that's it. He sees this as a matter of life and death. That's why he's clinging so ferociously to power. In response to this notion that Syria has this mighty, formidable army, it might be worth asking Paul this. It took the Syrian, the mightiest army in the Middle East, 4 weeks of heavy artillery shelling and the deployment of 7,000 soldiers to retake not a city, but a neighborhood in a city that was held by a few hundred rebels armed with Kalashnikovs hunting rifles and maybe a few pistols. That doesn't sound to me like the mightiest army in the Middle East. Also, this notion of its air defense systems, we haven't hit on that point yet, but it's been alluded to, especially by the United States.
Okay.
Can I just make this one point?
Do. Yeah.
This is a country that was invaded, its airspace was invaded 3 times by the Israelis in the last 20 years, and 1 shot was fired against Israeli planes. Not 1 plane was shot down. And remember, one of those sorties involved the destruction of a nuclear facility no one even knew Bashar al-Assad was building. So I take it very skeptically that their air defense systems, that their military capabilities are quite so robust. I quite agree with Paul on that point. And military defectors will back you up on this, by the way.
Okay, so the paper tiger argument. What about, though, the point that Roger and others put, which was it's not realistic to imagine the full-scale kind of military intervention you were talking about. Arming the opposition is about as much as is realistically on the agenda.
I mean, look, in principle, I think anything that will help tip the scales in the favor of the opposition is a good option at this point. My concern with simply running guns to Syria is as follows. Although it's true that the Free Syrian Army, or what I call just the independent consortium of rebel militias and brigades, is beginning to cohere and become more organized, it's still very much atomized. I mean, it goes not even region to region, but in some places, block to block. There are sort of neighborhood watch groups that have been erected. There is no chain of command. There is no cohesiveness. The reason I think a safe zone is indicated here is not just for humanitarian reasons, but to provide the opposition with a viable base of operations from which they can actually plan an insurgency to topple the regime. If you talk to rebels now, they say, we're not looking to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. We're looking to drain the regime's resources. This is a war of attrition. In order for them to change their strategy, I'm sorry, but the international community does have to get involved in the military aspects.
Let's just hear from Paul Conroy, if your experience dovetails with what we were hearing from Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept of, I mean, if I thought sending container loads of weapons into Syria now would help, I'd probably help carry it. Problem is, it's difficult enough getting a camera across Syria at this point in time. The FSA are very fragmented. There's no central control. It is extremely difficult to get anything to anywhere. They don't have safe areas like in Libya. We always had Benghazi to fall back to.
It's a very practical...
Parts of Misrata. You know, just the sheer logistics.
Where will you put the army? Where will you put the whole weapons?
In the hands of fighters.
Fighters where? In Turkey? They will build the army in Turkey and attack Syria. Then it will be country against country.
Well, that's happening. That's happening today.
Okay,
that's already happening.
I mean, we see that it's not effective.
Rana's been waiting very patiently. Let's hear from Rana Kamana and then Roger.
First of all, we've tried nothing but dialogue with Assad. The world has tried nothing but dialogue, and that is the grievance of the mothers of Syria who have lost their children. We have had him called a reformer as late as June by William Hague, by Hillary Clinton, even though he had already shown his true colors. So that's one thing. The second thing is this myth of a strong Syrian army is simply ridiculous. This is not a national army. This is a sectarian killing machine that has been founded by the Assads and that has been sustained and given succor by the sectarian regime.
But Malik says 2 million hardcore supporters.
2 million,
that's something.
but this is a country of 23 million plus. How can you have a civil war between 2 million people and 18 million? I mean, the numbers don't work out. Second thing is that this is an army that is a conscript army. So that means that people are forced to serve in the army. Those who are serving in the army are mainly from the dispossessed Sunni working class, as Malik described. They would do anything to defect. The price of defection, as I just said, is intolerably high, and that is what needs to be aided, because no one is going to die for the Assads from this point on, because they understand now, despite the propaganda, and propaganda does work, the Syrians have 42 years of it, it does work, it does brainwash people. Despite the propaganda, people are beginning to understand that a regime that tortures children, gang rapes girls of 10 by official order, that trades in the organs of prisoners, is not a regime that you want to die for.
Thank you. Roger, this is going to be the last thing, and then we're going to take questions. Yeah.
Nadim, I mean, what in the 42-year history of the Assad regime leads you to think that these guys are interested in compromise or might ever want to engage in a dialogue? I mean, here's a guy who came to London, who studied ophthalmology here in London, breathed the liberal air of this great city, married a woman with a British passport, goes back to his country and he kills 9,000 people. That's what he took away from London.
But he represents a group. He's not only alone with his family there. He represents a group.
Can I just finish?
Yeah, please.
Can you point to one thing in this 4 decades plus history of this family that might lead us to think that they might be interested in dialogue? I don't see anything. And on the army, I mean, others have made this point. I mean, this inglorious, ineffective, whack-a-mole kind of policy they've been pursuing for the last year. I mean, it's absolutely hapless. What makes you think this is a powerful army? And there is a powerful army in the world. It's the US Army. And look what's been happening to the US Army in Afghanistan and previously in Vietnam. You don't have to line up some massive fighting force if the popular will of a country is moving against the dominant military force.
Let Nadim answer briefly, and then I want to take contributions. No.
I think we are missing the point. Of course, it needs not 7,000, 10,000 soldiers for a neighborhood, because you are not making an invasion of something you destroy and walk. It's not a country against country. You are talking about a military which was formed to oppose another military in a residential areas. Of course you need 7,000 in a neighborhood, because they are not using all the tanks, in Latakia. I was there when the military operation happened in Latakia. I was in Latakia. I mean, you have the sea, you have the air, you have the land. I think only the option can make the Syrian people pay very dearly and awfully.
Thank you. And we're going to pause there.